gardening for pollinators and runoff prevention on and off the Squam Lakes Association campus. Got some great pictures here. We have our monarch, of course. We've got our sweat bee, another native bee in New Hampshire. New England aster, which is one of my favorite flowering plants, just because it flowers for so long and is so beautiful for so long. And of course, the red columbine, another one of my favorites. So historically, landscaping has actually changed quite a bit. The European standard for gardening was actually very interesting because it started out with only the richest people could have gardens that were used for just beauty. And so a lot of times they were using it for very opulent shows of, I'm so rich, I don't need a garden here. Here's this huge patch of green lawns that don't really help for much food production. And so there was a period of time where a lot of American gardens were like very based on having as beautiful green lawns as you can and huge hedgerows. The problem with this, of course, is that means that there's not very much food for landscapes. There's not very much food for pollinators because what they need is they need that nectar from the plants. So there has been a bit of a shift recently from the monoculture of having that lawn where it's just the one species of grass and you're keeping it very, very short towards that 1 inch. And there's been a shift towards landscaping for bringing in those pollinators. Not only is this much more beautiful, you're going to get the wide variety of colors, but it's also great for bringing in pollinators, which in turn is going to improve the plants that you're getting, as well as the vegetables that you're growing. There has also been a big push, and this is a bit of a controversial subject. I've gotten in several fights with my mother about getting rid of her lawn. So there has been quite a push towards getting rid of lawns and using that place as a place to attract pollinators. There's this man, his name is Doug Talmy. He is a professor of entomology. He's written a lot of books on ecology, and his big push is for Americans to get rid of at least half of their lawn space and turn it into native landscapes for pollinators. And his thing is that if every American got rid of half of their lawn, that would equal up to the size of more than all of the national parks in the United States in habitat creation. And so our push today is going to be a bit of a challenge to think about some of the space that maybe is a lawn right now that could be changed into a little bit more varied of an ecosystem. So this is not just because I hate lawns. It's all about creating habitat and allowing more places for your pollinators to live. One thing about lawns is that they are a monoculture, as I said. And monocultures are difficult because they are much more likely to bring in disease because one of a single plant is in the same area, and they don't support as many pollinators because you're not able to fit as many species there. Native plants actually support 29% more pollinators and native insect and bug species as non-native plants, and oftentimes the lawns that we plant are non-native species. So the thing about planting native that's very important is that the plants that are native to an area have evolved in order to both support the species, the animal species that are in an area, as well as to work together in a very ecologically friendly way. So as you can see in the bottom left, I have a picture of some native grasses and flowers in a range. And they are built so that they can compete with each other without outcompeting each other. And so some plants grow really, really tall so that they can get as much photosynthesis as possible. Some plants grow really small and large in order to get more photosynthesis. They also have varied lengths of roots, which is really important for having different niches at which they collect water and nutrients. Another really important part about this is that it keeps the soil in place. And so planting native plants is gonna reduce erosion because that webbing of differently lengthened and shaped roots is going to hold that land in place. So native plants are simply, as I said, plants that evolved to grow in an area, whereas non-native plants are plants that come from other places. There's a lot of talk about invasive species, of course, and invasive species are not all non-native species. Invasive species are just a particular plant that, because it wasn't evolved to grow in a certain area, doesn't have any biological control in that place. And so if it is established in a new place, it will easily take over and start to edge out a lot of those native plants. Maggie and I, would like to argue that we get rid of all invasive species, but that doesn't mean that we can't have any non-native species. They do play a role, they're very beautiful, and they can increase some of the flowering times for pollinators, as we can go over a little bit later. The other thing to talk about is annuals versus perennials. So annuals are plants that they do not establish a lot of structure in their roots year after year. So if you cut an annual at the stem, it doesn't have the root structure to grow back next year. Whereas perennials put a lot of energy into those roots, and so they can die back and then the next year come back from that root system. So annuals spend a lot of time on seed production and flower production, and they often are going to be a little bit more aggressively flowering because that's their main way of reproducing and getting pollination done. Whereas perennials are going to put more effort into root production. And so like maybe the first year or 2 years that you plant them, they're not going to be very beautiful. But going down the line, they're going to be able to ward off those invasives much better. They are also going to be better as erosion control. So back to this picture, like I said, ecological or sustainable landscaping is a pretty new-ish movement. The concept of using native plants has been gaining a lot of traction. The Ecological Landscaping Alliance has been working since 1992 towards using the natural systems that we see in nature as a model for landscaping in our own regions. And the great thing about this is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can look at how species interact in the wild and use that and replicate it in our own gardens. So let's make sure I didn't miss anything. So these two gardens are two gardens that I found from New Hampshire. They were put together by the Parker Garden Design Alliance, which is very cool. It is a company that uses all native plants and especially pollinator plants to put in native gardens in recreational homes and commercial areas in New Hampshire. So very cool company that I like a lot. Here we go. I'm going to turn it over to Maggie to talk about some pollinators.
Cecilia, since I have some transitions, do you mind stop sharing your screen and I'll start sharing mine?
Yes. There we go.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen, sharing that, and presenting. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about why we should cater to pollinators. So why should we cater to pollinators? It's really simple. Our lives depend on it. Without pollinators, we don't have food. So currently, if you were to look at a geology timeline, there used to be the Cambrian era, the Pleistocene, the Jurassic era. So right now where we are, it started around 10,000 years ago. We are in the Holocene era. Some more modern scientists are calling it the Anthropocene, and we regard this period of time as the time where humans are having a direct impact on natural history. And currently we are going through the 6th mass extinction that we can tell on Earth. It's also known as the silent extinction because not many people know that it's happening. I mean, we know about a lot of endangered mammals like polar bears and elephants and things like that, but really the main victims that we're seeing in this extinction are amphibians, insects, and birds, all invertebrates really. So going back to like 6th grade science, an invertebrate is an animal that doesn't have a backbone. So insects, some seafood, crustaceans, things like that. And this picture is one of the only graphs that you'll actually find. I had to do quite a bit of Google searching to find a good visual for you guys. And if you click the link on the slides, we're going to send you the presentation afterwards that you can go back and look at some of the sources. And there are links on there. So it's from this scientific paper that's linked in the slide. And so overall, what we want to see is insects, not honeybees, getting more visibility. And we want to raise awareness about that. And the reason that honeybees have kind of taken the spotlight for this big extinction awareness that people are trying to garner is because they give us something really tangible to hold on to. So people love, again, I use the example of polar bears, elephants, tigers were a big one for a while. And when you zoom in on a honeybee, they're really cute, they're furry, and they give us something honey. They give us honey and beeswax. It's a really tangible thing to hold on to. So people really like them. But what's wrong with honeybees? Nothing. Honeybees are great. They do us a really great service. We would also die without them. However, they're not as in immediate danger as other native pollinators. Also, another big thing is that they're livestock. So we do have stable populations. And just a little aside, like, yes, their populations are absolutely declining like most insects. But they're in a much better place than a lot of other insects that we should be focusing on. So giving our attention to honeybees is great, it does raise awareness, but that's not going to solve the problem that we have. So this is a mason bee calling for help because it's dying. And I'm sure if honeybees could feel empathy, they would say, yes, take my research funding. You need it just as much as me. So native pollinators like this mason bee, they're specifically designed to pollinate specific plants that maybe a honeybee isn't going to visit. Plants that we need for healthy ecosystems. And if those plants aren't getting pollinated, then they're going to die off and we're going to see this domino effect of whole areas of biodiversity just collapsing. So by helping the honeybees and pouring all this money into it, we are not always helping native pollinators, but by helping native pollinators, we're usually also helping honeybees too. So I am a big proponent of calling for a lot of focus to be shifted off of the honeybee and onto native bees so that we can help both of these groups. So in our gardens, you want to know which pollinators are you looking for. If you really want to, you can pick and choose based on what you want to plant. So different plants are going to attract different pollinators based on their shape, their size, colors, how much nectar they have, if they even have nectar, what do they smell like, and also UV light. And so we call these traits pollinator syndromes. And these relationships are going to be different based on your area. So if you're not from New Hampshire, do some research on your own, but we can also look at a little more of a universal overlook. So this is a really fun chart that I got from the US Forest Service. I call it a PST chart for pollinator syndrome traits. And so it's basically kind of like a Punnett square. You line up the trait that you're looking for in a plant and what a certain animal or pollinator is going to require from that plant. So as an example, if you want to attract butterflies, you might plant something that's bright red, purple, scarlet, that has a lot of nectar, but the nectar is really deeply hidden inside of the flower. The odor is faint, but it's still there. It's really nice and fresh. It does have pollen. It's, there's not a whole lot of pollen, but it's definitely there. And maybe the shape of the flower is going to be a narrow tube. It might have a landing pad, some surface area. And this goes along with where the nectar is, because butterflies have a really long proboscis and they can stick their tongues deep in there. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about bees. We're not going to focus too much on them just because, like I said before, there's a lot more research on honeybees and some other butterflies, and there's not as much research on bees. So I'm going to do kind of a quick overview and then give you some other resources that you can do a little bit of a deeper dive into. So does anybody have an idea of how many species of bee there are in New Hampshire? You can chime right in because I actually can't see you guys on my screen right now. So feel free to just chime right in, or Cecilia, if you want to read some answers from the chat for me. Oh, Cecilia, I cannot hear you.
Kathleen is guessing that there's 7. Susan has no idea.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so there are around 200 species of bees in New Hampshire. New England overall, I think, has about 500. And there's always like room to find more. There's a lot that we don't know about the insect world. And there are a lot of things that we don't know about bees. There are some bees that don't even look like the traditional bee. So it can be hard to identify. So our 2 most popular types of bees are sweat bees, and sweat bees, that's a whole family of bees. So they're the really tiny ones. Sometimes they're bright green, sometimes they're blue, iridescent, or sometimes they're just like black and metallic. And then the other most popular bee we have is the common bumblebee. So the one that you see in like cloverfields, dandelions, yeah, the common eastern bumblebee. But besides those 2, New Hampshire is home to mason bees, leafcutter bees, which are so cool. One of my goals this summer is to see a leafcutter bee in action, carpenter bees, and a lot more. So again, we'll send you guys these slides after the presentation, but there are 2 links. The first is for a pretty fun website. If you have kids, grandkids that want to know more about insects, this Insect ID site is really good, but it's definitely not comprehensive. The site could have a lot more on there than there is, but what's on there is pretty good. And then there's another link to the PDF that I was talking about that had all of these bumblebees. And Dorothy, that is where I learned about the confusing or perplexed bumblebee, Bombus perplexus, which I can't wait to learn more about. Looks adorable. So there are a few things that you can do to help native bees besides planting native species according to your chart. You can also provide shelter for bees. So contrary to popular belief, not all bees make hives, not all bees live together. Most of them are actually ground dwelling and they're solitary. Others are wood boring, so they live in holes left behind by beetles or even like reeds or plants that have hollow stems. So our super helpful thing that you can do is just leave a patch of bare soil somewhere in your yard, near your garden, and just make sure it's an area that's undisturbed. Not too many people are going to be walking on it, and it should have a pretty good amount of sun and shade during the day. You can also build a bee hotel. These have been getting really, really popular, but be careful because a lot of instructions online, and I have fallen victim to this like the past 3 times that I've built a bug hotel. A lot of the instructions are actually inadequate for a lot of bees. So you might get bugs in there, but you might not attract the bees that you want if you build it incorrectly. It's really kind of like a mathematical science. Bees are very picky about how long they want their holes to be, and if it's even a couple millimeters too deep or too short, they will not take residence. And one of the most important things to do with your bee hotel is to leave it out in the winter, because that's where a lot of bees are going to spend the winter. Lots of bugs don't migrate. And then clean it out in the spring so that you can make sure that you're eliminating any disease and waste, and then hopefully they'll start to take up residence in the summertime again and maybe find another overwintering home in it. And this is also a great opportunity to create structures for more than just bees. And so like I built a bug hotel that was not suitable for bees, even though I really wanted bees to come. I found out later that I'd done it wrong, but I did find salamanders in it, which is so cool. And the salamanders laid their eggs in there. I don't know if they hatched, but it's just pretty cool. And there's a lot of other important bugs that we'll get to and talk about. But here's also a link. I believe it's either Michigan State or Minnesota State University. They have a really good PDF instructions for how to build a proper bee hotel. Okay, let's talk about monarch butterflies. I've been doing a deep dive into monarch butterflies lately, and they're really cool. So I'm going to take you guys back to middle school, and I just wanted to show us a really nice metamorphosis video. If it'll play. Let's hope. Okay, so that is pretty much the end of the video. Oops. Let's go back to this. My goodness. Here we go. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the caterpillar. So you could see how much energy it must take to get to form that chrysalis and then completely turn yourself into goo and emerge as something completely different. So as I'm sure we all know from that kid's book, The Hungry Caterpillar, it grows a lot. So the caterpillar goes through 5 stages. They're called instars. And so these are the different molting periods that the caterpillar goes through, kind of like reptiles, how they lose their skin. And we can tell which period of instar the caterpillar is in by how big the tentacles on its head are. So this is the, right out of the egg. It's first before it's really molted anything. And then the second one, we can see it's getting 2 little horns, and the size of the caterpillar does vary. There are hungrier caterpillars than others. So these are both the second instar. And then on to the third, getting a little bit longer. That one is so tiny compared to the one in the earlier picture. Then here's the fourth one. The tentacles are going beyond its head. So the longer tentacles are going to be where the head is. They look pretty identical. I'm sure that's for some reason. And then the fifth is that classic, kind of scary looking caterpillar. And it's after this molt that the caterpillar will start to go into its chrysalis and start pupating. And just here's another picture so that you can see for some size comparison. Thank you, butterfly lady, whoever you are, for making this picture. I really like it. It's good visual. So monarchs, where do they breed and where do they go afterwards? So I'm sure a lot of us have seen those magnificent photos and videos of tons of monarchs in the fir forest. So it's pretty widely known now that monarchs migrate to Mexico. And so this graph shows the proportion, so like how many butterflies in at least Eastern North America, including the Midwest, are heading down to Mexico. So for the Northeast, which is our region, you might be in a different one, depending on where you're tuning in from, we have about 15% of North America's monarch population. And this migration is still kind of a mystery to scientists, so you can be a great citizen scientist, and there's a big effort to record monarchs wherever you see them. And this is really going to help us piece the gaps together. So we can see that a big portion of the population is coming from the Midwest. And before we dive into why that is, I want to talk about host plants because lots of gardeners, they love to help monarchs, but they have trouble attracting them, even if they're planting milkweed, which is the host plant for monarchs. So many animals have host plants, and that simply means they require that plant to reproduce. It might not have anything to do with food. It's just for reproduction. Sometimes we don't know why, sometimes we can guess. So the most common reasons for host plants are food. In the case of the monarch, this rings true. The caterpillars can only digest a specific plant, or it gets some sort of unique nutritional boost, and that will help its chances of survival. Protection, which is also true in the case of the monarch. The plant might make either the caterpillar or the adult poisonous, or it could also just provide a physical cover from predators. Like if it's, say if the host plant is a shrub that has a lot of branches or a lot of thorns, it's going to be harder for predators like birds to get in there. And survival. Maybe this plant is really well adapted to environmental and man-made factors. Maybe it's doing really well in adapting to climate change, which means the plant is more likely to survive. Therefore, it's a reliable food source, and it'll increase the chances of the young survival. So there are other factors at play here, but those are really the 3 most common. So just to review, host plant doesn't mean that the adult animal feeds exclusively on this plant. Adult monarchs are going to feed on lots of different plants, but the caterpillars will only feed on milkweed. The adults don't require them to survive, the future generations do. So if you want to help out monarchs, absolutely plant some native milkweed species, but you're also going to have to plant a lot of nectar species, which we'll go over later, to actually attract the adults to come. So now that we've talked about milkweed, what's up with the Midwest? What do they do best besides, oh, gonna squeeze on past you there. Corn, And soybeans. So these are two of the most popular crops that we see in the Midwest. And so obviously those are both monocultures, and a lot of more modern scientists and young people like myself, we tend to see a monoculture and go, ugh, because monoculture, it's bad, right? Mostly. So monocultures, which basically just means, in case anybody is confused with that word, it's just an area of land where there's only one species present. So they aren't very biodiverse, but croplands are still a really unique habitat that can benefit species like the monarch butterfly. And so lots of the continent's milkweed grows in Midwestern croplands and grasslands. But there are a few reasons why the monarchs prefer the milkweed that's in the cropland rather than the neighboring grasslands. So the first one is that the soil is richer. The farmers are fertilizing it. They're putting a lot of effort into making sure that they're growing really good crops, and the milkweed benefits from that. It's irrigated, so there's going to be plenty of sun and nutrients, and it will get shade later in the season, so the milkweed isn't going to dry out, and neither will the caterpillars on the milkweed, and that's at least in the case of corn. I'm not really sure how tall soybean gets. I'm sure milkweed grows taller, but if you know how tall soybeans gets, let me know. And it's also mechanically disturbed during the growing season. So this is the one that is really important and really draws the line in the sand for why monarchs are going to prefer a cropland milkweed. So mechanical disturbance: before herbicides, farmers manicured their fields the old-fashioned way. They used hand pulling, and then later on we had tractors. And so they would go and they would till the crops, harvest it, cut out all the weeds. And so milkweed, it can really easily grow back from its roots that remain intact after their stems are cut above ground. Even early pesticides weren't really that effective against milkweed roots because they were just really hardy. So this kept the milkweed population young and leafy because farmers were constantly going out and cutting mature plants, and then they would grow back. And I mean, a farmer doesn't have time to be out there every single day cutting milkweed. So the population kind of stayed really leafy and herbaceous. But then what changed? Herbicide tolerance. So science started to get really advanced. We started creating more GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and we do this a lot with our crops. So big agriculture started developing herbicide tolerant seeds for lots of crops, two of which were corn and soybean. So this is really great if you're a farmer. You don't have to spend as much money and resources going out and weeding, but it's not great for the milkweed. Because as herbicides get stronger, the milkweed is eventually going to die off. It's not going to grow back, and plants that are growing back are still going to get killed along with any eggs and caterpillars on them, because, you know, you're going to want to be more liberal with a spray if you know that your crops aren't going to be affected by it. So might as well just get the weeds gone, because it's not taking as much energy as physically going out there with a tractor or with your hands and clippers. So since there's no more cropland milkweed, the monarchs are going to move to the grasslands, which it looks a lot like an empty lot, or if you've seen pictures of the Midwest, that's a huge prairie ecosystem. So they're going to move there to lay their eggs, but the grasslands aren't managed, so the milkweed plants are undisturbed. Initially, I was like, oh, that's great. They can just freely grow. But like we said before, monarchs are actually preferring these younger milkweed plants. So the undisturbed milkweed, it's got hardier stems, tougher leaves that might be harder for the caterpillars to chew. And also a big factor is that there's a lot more predators in these grasslands because there aren't humans and pesticides being thrown around. So these are two graphs. They're both the same graphs, but I just want to look at the one on the left for a second, the orange one. So this shows the total forest area that's occupied by monarch colonies. So this graph shows a location in Mexico where they're overwintering. And through the years, you can see that their populations are definitely declining. They had a really great year in 96 and 97, and then slowly we've been declining. And you can see in the corner there of that graph that it's kind of an opposite relationship with the amount of herbicide-tolerant corn and soybean crops that are being planted. So as that amount increases, the amount of monarchs that make it to their overwintering sites is decreasing. And the graph on the right next to it, I know it's really hard to see. It's the same graph, but that blue line represents the amount of locations in which we're looking for monarch butterflies. So you can also see that the more we're looking for them, the less we're finding them, which is only reinforcing the evidence that monarch populations are in a huge decline. So there's lots of ways that you can make monarch-friendly gardens and something called a monarch way station. You might have heard of that program. So this is a specialized pollinator garden that makes great habitat for monarchs to make sure that they can survive their migration and have a successful brood. So the first thing that you are going to want is lots of sun, but also some protection from the sun. So ideally 6 hours or more, but you're also going to need shelter. So plants close together, but not too crowded. So this is again for predators, and also you're going to need some shade so that the caterpillars don't dry out. Lots of nectar plants, because now we know that adult monarchs don't actually feed on milkweed. They only use it to lay eggs. So you're going to need a lot of plants for the monarchs to feed on, because the host plants don't provide adequate food. Milkweed. The right kinds of milkweed. There are dozens of species of milkweed in the United States. And I believe that we have a link somewhere, and it leads you to a website where you can click on what region you're in, and it'll show you the species of milkweed that you can be planting. And management. You do have to do some upkeep on your pollinator gardens. Keep your milkweed young, like we said, because that's what the adults prefer. And you can follow this link to monarchwatch.org. Say that 5 times fast. And they've really helped. I got a lot of my information from them. They're a really cool site, lots of great citizen science programs. If you'd like to get more involved, I definitely suggest visiting them. Okay, before we move on, I just want to make sure we don't have any questions. Okay, so now we're going to move on to birds. Birds are really important for plant survival. Only some birds, like the ruby-throated hummingbird, actually drink nectar and provide the classic pollination that we see, where like the pollen gets stuck in their feathers and then they move to another plant and they pollinate it that way. Other birds are seed spreaders, or they simply pollinate because they land on a flower bush, take a rest, and then they fly to another one and the pollinations arrive. So are there any other things that you guys can think of that birds are helpful for? Again, Cecilia, if you could read some of those to me and then we can go over them in a bit.
Yeah.
So you can
I
just...
can think of one.
Yeah.
They eat the predators of the pollinators that we're trying to bring about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, anybody else can think of what birds would be really helpful for in your garden? Besides just being nice, and they're really fun to watch. Along with pollinators, we're getting very into birds.
Maybe you just move on and tell us, Maggie.
Yeah. Well, fun fact about the bird in this picture, black-capped chickadees. They will collect hundreds of caterpillars a day to feed their brood. So what I'm getting at is what Cecilia said, is that their birds are really good for predators. They're also great for keeping your garden clean, because birds are going to be collecting leaves and twigs, and they're going to help you do some maintenance on your garden and keep it tidy. But you do kind of want a messy garden, as Cecilia will get to a little bit later. So hummingbirds, Unfortunately, we only have one species of hummingbird in the Northeast, but that's okay. They're really pretty. So the ruby-throated hummingbird, they're really essential pollinators. So the best way to attract them is using native plants. Hummingbirds are a lot more familiar, and they're going to be more likely to visit the plants that they're familiar with. Artificial feeders. They are okay very early in the season and very late in the season when food is scarce, but the flower nectar is healthier for the bird, it's healthier for your garden. Those feeders can spread diseases, and that can ultimately really put a wrench in populations, which is not good. And also we don't want to be feeding the wildlife. We never want animals to become dependent on man-made food. Also, it can attract bears too, which we have plenty of bears in New Hampshire. And so hummingbirds really like long, trumpeted, open petals because they have really long beaks. And bright colors. So reds and pinks are the most attractive, but other bright colors like yellows and oranges are really good for them too. And just a note, when you're choosing different hummingbird plants, trumpet vines, salvias, and butterfly bushes are all great plants for them, but you have to keep in mind that there are invasive varieties that are still attractive to hummingbirds. So do your research for your area to make sure that you're not planting something that we don't need. Okay, so just to wrap up birds, because we really encourage you to do your own research on this, but for some overarching issues that you might have in your garden, here are some birds that might help. So to get rid of worms and grubs, black-capped chickadees, like we said before. Wrens are really good. They're also one of the most beautiful birds in my opinion. And bluebirds, which I have seen one bluebird in my entire life. I would love to see some more. For tree trunk pests and like wood-boring insects, like beetles, you can get nuthatches, which we have no shortage of here in Holderness. Every morning, they are so loud, but very cute. Woodpeckers, also very loud in the morning. And sapsuckers, which look like woodpeckers. They're a little bit different. They kind of go in and they'll make holes that will like girdle a tree trunk. So it's really cool. I have a blue spruce at my parents' house in New York, and the whole trunk is just like a spiraling staircase of sapsucker holes, which is really cool. Hasn't killed the tree yet somehow. But yeah, sapsuckers are really cool. We have the yellow-bellied sapsucker here. And then for weeds, really the only one I could find, because I didn't go too deep into a rabbit hole, were goldfinches, which are really, really pretty. So that will help. They eat a lot of weed seeds. Keep in mind that what they eat will also come out. So definitely do some more research to make sure that the bird might not be doing more harm than good. Okay, now I'm going to hand it back over to Cecilia.
Alrighty.
I will
sharing my screen.
Stop my share. And remember, you guys can put questions in the chat at any time, and we'll look at the end of each section.
Okay. Let me get down to where we're at in the presentation. So now we've gone into a lot of pollinators. We're convinced we do need them. We love them. Let's talk a little bit about gardening in New Hampshire. I'm sure if you're here, you probably already have been doing a lot of gardening, but I would also like to welcome any new gardeners. So just going to go over a couple of basic things. In New Hampshire, we are in hardiness zones 4 and 5. Basically, this just has to do with how cold it gets during the winter. And it kind of gives you an idea of which plants are going to be hardy in your area and which ones are going to require the least amount of maintenance. You can, of course, plant plants that are higher or that are that grow better in places that are warmer, but they're going to require more maintenance. You're probably going to have to bring them in the winter. And if it is a perennial plant in Florida, you might have to treat it like an annual in New Hampshire or bring it inside in the winter. And so when you're looking for plants, definitely look into which hardiness zone that they are adjusted to. And this is also probably going to give you a hint as to whether or not the plant is a native plant. And that's something that Maggie and I would like to encourage, is using as many native plants in your gardening as possible. The other thing is mowing. So you are going to have some lawn left, of course, and mowing is also very helpful in some of the native gardens and meadows, as we're going to talk about later. But we do need to be a little bit strategic about when we're mowing our lawns. And the way to think about it is we want to mow at times that's going to be the least detrimental to the pollinator species that we're trying to attract. Because pollinators are pretty fragile, any disturbance can very much upset them. And so as much as we can in New Hampshire, we want to try and mow before May 1st and after October 15th. It's also okay to do between the June 20th and July 10th window. That's when a lot of pollinators are a little bit less, they're not going through as much breeding. This is especially true for monarch butterflies. So we want to be a little bit careful. And the other thing to think about is if you are going to be mowing, maybe do it in sections. So you mow one section 1 week and then the next section in a different week. And this is going to allow there to be a little bit of undisturbed habitat for your pollinators to run away to while you are disrupting the world just a little bit. So another suggestion is to start mowing it a little bit higher. A lot of our lawns are mowed at around 1 inch high, which means that it's not going to be a very good habitat for many, many species. But the higher you start mowing, the more types of grasses and plants that are going to actually be able to survive and flower and bloom in our lawns. And that also means that there's going to be more pollinators coming there. It's also going to mean that a lot of other animals, such as frogs, are going to be able to find habitat within the forbs of your forbs and grasses. So that's one thing that I would like to encourage, is to start mowing a little bit less and leaving it a little bit longer. So first, I'm going to go into a little bit about rain gardens. Rain gardens are really, really cool. It's this idea of using plants and especially plants that are used to wetter areas to start and soak up some of that water that's coming off of the landscaping that you're doing. A lot of people put these underneath their rain gutters. So all that water that's being directed from the top of your house will go straight into your rain garden. And the thing about rain gardens is that they're going to prevent erosion. They're going to stop the water from shooting through one area. And this is going to stop a lot of sediments from being picked up and going into the drainage systems. Because in the Squam Lakes area, what's going to be happening is a lot of this water is going to, it might go into the street. And if it goes into the street, it'll pick up pollutants that are on the concrete, and that will all funnel towards the Squam Lake. And so by establishing a rain garden, you're going to stop the water, the plants are going to use that water, and then they're going to filter it back down through the ground, which is going to filter out some of those pollutants. It's also going to stop that erosion from happening in your area. So rain gardens, there's actually a lot of different types of them. Some of the most popular ones are the ones, like I said, where you funnel your gutter straight into it. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. A lot of people do tubing that then slowly disperses. And so you will like take out, you'll either find an indent in the lawn and plant your plants directly into there, or you can actually dig out a section. And then you're going to do a saturation test by digging a hole in the ground, roughing up the edges and filling it with water. And based on how quickly that water is able to drain, you can make decisions about what types of plants you're going to put into this garden. And so the longer it takes the water to filter through, the more wetland type plants you need to choose for your rain garden. But if you pour water into your big hole and it immediately goes away, you can actually start to put in a lot of plants that maybe you would actually put in your pollinator garden. And the great thing about these is that they can actually get rid of some soggier areas in our lawns. This one, I believe, was put in by the University of New Hampshire Extension as a model rain garden, and it was kind of a soggier area in somebody's lawn, and they simply turned it into this rain garden that's going to reduce a lot of runoff into the area. The program that we are planning our rain garden off of with the Squam Lakes Association is Soak Up the Rain New Hampshire, and I'll have a link to that, of course. But they have a lot of really great resources about choosing what types of plants to put into your rain garden, as well as designing the rain garden that's perfect for you. So there's a video that I have here about setting up a rain garden. I'll let you watch that on your own time if you're interested. It is a very cool concept that you can start to think about establishing in your area. Of course, you could put a rain garden and a pollinator garden together, but it very much depends on the type of soil that you have. And so that is all the information I mostly have about rain gardens. There is endless amounts of research that you can do on it. So I encourage you to go on that deep dive. Oh, now it wants to play. No, thank you. Okay. Let's get back to pollinators, finally. So what we need to do when we're thinking about attracting pollinators is, number one, like Maggie said, we can decide what species we want to attract. And to a certain extent, what we really want is just to have a healthy ecosystem. And a healthy ecosystem, it means that we're going to have the mix of the ones that we really, really want, like the monarch butterflies, as well as ones that we're not so familiar with, like a lot of beetles. But you can definitely decide to target your garden towards the species that you want to see. Then you can use the helpful chart that Maggie showed us to identify what types of flowers these pollinators are attracted to. And this can be helpful if you can't find information on the website of the nursery that you're trying to buy from. And if you look at a picture of the flower and you say, well, this has a deep tube, maybe this is really good for hummingbirds, maybe this is really good for butterflies. The other thing that I would very much recommend is creating a bloom time chart. And so this is something that's going to make sure that the pollinators you're trying to attract are going to have food for the entirety of the season that they're going to be around. So we created a pretty rough and ready bloom time schedule for the plants that we already have on the Squam Lakes Association campus. And so what we have spicebush, we have dandelion, we have goldenrod, and we have gone in and decided what times of the year it's going to be blooming. And we wanted to make sure that we had plants that were blooming all the way from March until October. And ideally, we want to make sure that each type of pollinator, so butterflies and beetles, are going to have something to eat throughout the whole season. But it is quite a project to embark on. So it's the sort of thing that is going to change from season to season, and you want to make sure that you're just keeping track of what you're adding. And if you have any wide empty spaces in which you don't have anything that's simply blooming. So the other thing that is important to do is to make sure that the pollinators you're trying to attract have everything that they're going to need in order to survive in the area. So some of the thoughts are what is going to eat the insects that you're trying to bring around, and what kind of biological controls can you use. So like Maggie was saying, some caterpillars get eaten by predatory insects. Those predatory insects could be eaten by native bird species. And so what do you need to do to attract the bird species that are going to protect your caterpillars? You can also think about water. Lots of species need water, and they need a way to get to it. A little bit of the hard thing about this is we don't want to have standing water in our gardens often. This can lead to mosquito larvae establishing, and nobody wants mosquitoes. And so one thing to think about is maybe put in a system to have that water be flowing constantly, or just go about changing the water every 3 days or so, and that'll prevent mosquitoes from finding a happy habitat there. Maggie was saying that some bee species need little bee houses. They could also use open soil to create homes. And so just think about the species that you're trying to attract and make sure that you have a habitat that's going to support them. Okay. Now we're going to talk about, I think, one of my favorite subjects, which is pollinator meadows versus pollinator gardens. And so pollinator meadows are going to be the sort of thing that you would see if you were to go out into the Great Plains, but you're also going to see them here in New Hampshire. There aren't many meadows. They have a lot been taken up by agricultural areas, but you're still going to be able to come across some of them if you're hiking, I have found. Meadows are made up of only native species. Like I said in the native species slide, native species kind of form a perfect ecosystem where each plant is competing with the other ones. And so they have their own ecological niche where they get nutrients from a certain depth of soil and they get their sun from a certain height. And so if there are any non-native species in that ecosystem, it's actually going to disrupt the whole thing. And so the healthiest ecosystems are going to be made up of native species. And when you only have those native species, it does mean that you're going to have less management that you're going to have to do. One of the things you do have to do for a pollinator meadow is a little bit of mowing, and this is going to keep some of those bigger weeds from growing there. So one of the things that could really establish itself in a meadow, if you're not careful, is trees. And so if you're mowing at around 3 to 6 inches, about once a season, you're going to prevent that from happening. A pollinator meadow takes about 3 years to establish, and I'm going to go through all the steps of doing that because I think that it's a really important way to create habitat. That's actually not going to be too much work for whoever's putting it in. Pollinator gardens can have both native and non-native species. Again, I'm going to recommend that you try as hard as possible to put in majority native species because they do support 29 times more species than the non-native ones, or than the native ones. But if, like I said, you are not able to get a continuous blooming schedule without non-native species, it's perfectly reasonable to put some of those in. Okay. So meadows are an area of about 400 square feet. So they can actually be fairly small. And what you're going to do if you're going to start from a place of no plants or a place of lawn, you're going to mow that lawn as short as you possibly can. And then you're going to cover all of the grass with a couple of different methods. I think the one that probably is going to work the best is using black plastic sheeting, and you just cover up that whole area and put something heavy on top so that the grass underneath cannot photosynthesize. And the best way to go about this is to put this down from the very first green of the season. So you're going to kill off that first wave of grass as it comes in. And then every 3 to 6 weeks, you're going to take off the black plastic and you're going to see how dead the grass is. You're going to leave the plastic off for a week to allow the seeds that are still in the seed bank to sprout up. And then you're going to put that black plastic back down and kill it off. And the absolute best way to establish a meadow is to do this all season, from April-ish to September. And the reason that you're going to go about this, it sounds like a lot of work, but the reason that you're going to do it is because it's going to make sure that there's absolutely no seeds in the seed bank that are the ones that you don't want. So once you get into September, you need to do the best you can to prevent yourself from tilling it up. Tilling is actually going to create a disturbance, which is what invasive plants really, really like, and makes it very easy for them to establish. So you're going to take your meadow mix and seed the garden. There's a lot of really good resources for which plants to plant in meadows in New Hampshire. The one that I would very much recommend is the UNH Extension Service. They have incredible resources about pollinators and specifically about putting in meadows. And they're going to have really good solutions for whatever type of soil that you have. So you're going to seed your meadow and rake it lightly just to cover those seeds up, and add a clean layer of straw, and that's going to protect the seeds over the winter, stop those nasty birds from coming in and stealing everything. So in the first spring, it's not going to be very impressive. You might feel a little discouraged because Like I said, a lot of perennial grasses and flowers spend a lot of time establishing energy in their roots. And so a meadow is made up of majority perennial flowers. And so that first season, they're going to be putting most of their energy into making sure that their root systems are really strong. And this is really great for us because it means that once those native species have established themselves, it's going to be almost impossible for invasive species to come in and establish. And so while they might not be that impressive the first year, you might see a couple of flowers. And the only thing that you need to do that spring is to absolutely not weed the garden and just mow between 4 to 6 inches high in the middle of the summer. And that should be in the June to July period. I believe it's June 20th to July 10th. And that's going to make sure that any pollinators that you've already started to attract are going to be protected. So that's that season. And then year 2, you're going to start to see a lot of those flowers and all their root stuff is going to really, all the time they spent investing in those roots is going to come to fruition this second season and the third season even more. And so once these gardens are established, they're going to be almost impossible for invasive species to come in. And that is going to be really nice because you don't have to do that much work on them. You just have to mow every once in a while just to make sure that some of those bigger trees are not going to start coming in here. One of the things is perennials, they do come back year after year after year, but they can kind of exhaust themselves. And so once in a while, you will need to reseed in a couple places with specific plants, but it's kind of a case-by-case basis. Alrighty. Anybody, any questions about sorts of things? Okay. So a pollinator
Cecilia, are you still there? Oh, oops. Cecilia's computer died. So yeah, if you want to sit here.
All right, everybody, a little bit of musical chairs going on. If you want to share your screen, Maggie.
Yeah, let's.
Yeah. So pollinator meadows are incredible. One of the problems with them, I would say, is that they do look a little bit more unruly. And so they might not be the sort of thing that you can plant in your front yard in the neighborhood. Because people might be grumpy about the the grasses and things that are really tall out there. And so the other solution is to put in a pollinator garden. So pollinator gardens are fairly similar to meadows in a way. You're trying to put in as many native species as you can. You're also trying to attract pollinators with them. But the difference is that they're a little bit more intentional and they do require a bit more planning. So with a pollinator garden, you have to, generally, the concept is you want to put like species together so that all the species that are going to attract monarch butterflies are going to be in pretty established clumps. And that can help the butterflies find where it is. It also just kind of looks nice. It makes it look a little bit more intentional. With pollinator gardens, you want to plant your smaller plants in front and then the taller plants either in the middle or the back, depending on the shape of the garden. They require a little bit more planning when you're putting them in. You want to think about how your edges look and maybe where you're going to put your water sources and any feeders if you end up putting those in. So the thing about putting in pollinator gardens is you want to, as I said, have a bit of a multi-story dimensionality. And this is really good because having really short plants is good for some pollinators, whereas the tall plants are really good for others, as well as creating protection and also shading out some of those weeds and non-native plants that are trying to establish themselves there. So you're going to select plants with a continuous flowering period again, but this time it might be good to think about when they're going to be flowering and what section of the garden they're actually in. That's me. Okay.
Me again. So how to start planting your garden? The first step is to draw it out. So physically drawing your garden in pretty moderate detail is going to help you plan. Mistakes and changes made on paper are going to be really easier to execute than any mistakes or changes that are in the ground. It's also easier to remember like exactly where you want to put things if it's on paper and you can look at it. I really recommend like taking a picture of your garden. There are also some smartphone apps, or if you're really good at graphic design, there are some desktop programs where you can take a picture of your garden, put it on the screen, and you can do that from your phone or your computer. Me personally, like I would like to use a sketch pad, old-fashioned pen and paper. You're also going to have more ideas than if you're just simply like walking around and making mental notes in your head. And another important thing is to think about the colors before you get your heart set on a specific plant. And that is where step 2 comes in. So the second step is going to be to get a soil test. Garden centers sell these soil tests. You can do it yourself, or you can check your area's local extension. For New Hampshire, it's UNH. And you can send it into a lab and they'll give you a more detailed workup of what's going on in your soil. So basically what you're doing is you're testing the pH of your soil. So that's how alkaline or acidic your soil is based on a scale of 1 to 14, 1 being really acidic like vinegar, and 14 being really basic like lye. So this can change in different areas of your garden. So you're gonna want to test a few spots. Like I said, garden centers sell easy DIY kits. If you are going to be sending it into a lab, there's usually a small fee associated with that. So just keep that in mind so you're not caught out of the blue. And for most plants, the ideal soil is going to be really balanced. So between like a 6, 7, 8. But other plants are going to thrive in different types of soil. Like wildflowers, for example, like for some reason, they just like kind of unhealthy soil. They're really good at growing in not great soil. And there are things that you can do if you find that you have either really acidic or really basic soil. There are definitely ways that you can balance that out so that you can plant what you want. So to bring it back to a neutral pH, you can add lime if your soil's too acidic, or you can add sulfur if it's too alkaline or basic. And usually you want to start doing this in the fall. So if your soil is unbalanced this year, obviously, you know, the time to start planting is going to be coming up pretty quickly. So if your soil is unbalanced this year, do your research on what flowers are going to thrive in your type of soil, and then focus on neutralizing it off the next season so that you can still have a nice garden to enjoy. And you're also going to want to look at plants that could like change the pH of your soil, because they, you know, it is possible if you plant something, it's going to neutralize it and bring it a little bit more to where you want it to be. And so now that you know what the pH of your soil is, look at plants that will fit your image and also grow successfully in the type of soil environment that's present in your garden plot. And then, yeah, so step 3, picking your plants based on your soil. And so there are a few things that you definitely need to consider. So are the plants you have going to maintain or change the pH that you have on your plot? Wildlife. You're not going to want to plant something that's going to attract like deer, for example, because they will just eat your entire garden. And also, is the plant, is it toxic to wildlife and other pets? There are lots of roots out there that are really toxic. And, you know, I've had neighbors whose pets were killed, unfortunately, because of something they planted in their garden. And this can also ring true for kids. Kids love to play in the dirt, so you definitely want to do a lot of research on what you're planting. Do your plants benefit the landscape? Like we said again, and we will keep saying this until the last slide. Are you planting anything invasive? Nurseries sell so many invasive plants because they look really pretty. So you really have to be careful about that. Erosion, pollution, carbon sinking. Are your plants causing it? Are they preventing it? How's the air quality where you live? You can plant things to improve the air quality. If you see different things popping up, that can give you an indication of what things are like. Lichen species, so lichen is an organism. It's like a cross between a fungus and an algae. They grow on trees, on rocks. Lichen are a great indicator of air quality. So if you see those kind of flat, really crusty lichen on tree bark or rocks, those can grow anywhere. It doesn't matter how poor the air quality is, they're going to grow. The ones that almost kind of look like paper that maybe you could peel off of a tree, that's an indicator of like a pretty good air quality. I could live there. I'd want to live there. And then the ones that kind of look like wizard beards that have really long tendrils and are hanging off on trees, those are indicators of really good air quality. So if you're a hiker, for example, if you hike in the White Mountains, you'll see a lot of those longer lichens because the air is just so clean and pristine up there. And one of the most important things to consider is where are you getting your plants and where do they get their plants from? So being attracted to pollinators, as in like you're buying the right shape, the right color, the right amount of nectar, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be good for the pollinators. Some nurseries use pesticides because their customers just want pretty plants. Others might not use pesticides, but the suppliers do. And you have a power as a consumer. Cecilia and I went to a webinar yesterday hosted by the LRCC Society, which is an invertebrate conservation group. And they taught us all about how to go in and talk to your nursery manager and be like, what pesticides are you using? Do you sell any organic plants? You know, what can I do as a consumer to make you use less pesticides? What can I do in my garden? To help prevent that? What are you doing in your nursery that's worked for you that doesn't involve pesticides? So we really have power. Ask about what they use, what their suppliers use, and buy organic. The organic label has some flaws, but overall it's a really good indicator that these plants have not been sprayed with a lot of harmful pesticides that have been known to kill or decline populations. And if you've already bought something and then you find out that it's been sprayed, you can absolutely quarantine your plants. We're all familiar with this now. Basically, you're just keeping your plants separate or you're putting a screen over them so that bugs aren't going and pollinating them because pesticides can stay on the plants for a really long time. We learned yesterday that some woodier shrubs and trees, they will test positive for a pesticide an entire year and upwards of a year after they've been sprayed. So some things that you can do also is if your sprayed plant is blooming, cut off the blossoms. And depending on how long the pesticide is going to stay there, you might have to do it for a couple seasons. We really want to make sure that we are not spreading pesticides into the environment. So some alternatives to our friend like the hornworm. Prevention is really the best method. It's always going to be the best method, but that's really hard to do. So another alternative is good old hand picking. You can also plant flowers that are more attractive to the pests than the flowers that you're trying to keep the pests away from. So like we saw in this webinar yesterday that nurseries were using marigolds to attract all of the pests to keep them away from their other plants that were for sale. So I thought that was pretty cool. And so just reiterating, like a non-chemical tactic should always be used first, and it should always be backed by good science. So gardener blogs, they always have good intentions, but they do not always have good information. They spread a lot of false and harmful information unknowingly. We did a lot of research over the last few weeks for this presentation, and we were like going through blogs and being like, that is not true. That is a horrible suggestion. Oh no, like where are these people getting their information from? So you just want to be sure that it's backed by science, checking websites like New Hampshire Fish and Game, the Forest Service, things like that. University websites are always really reputable. They were the most helpful when we were doing our research.
And the UNH extension website is incredible. They also have a hotline for calling master gardeners, so you can call that line and really ask any questions that you have. And I'll have that phone number at the end of the presentation.
Again, if you have to spray, sometimes it's unavoidable. Maybe you just have way too many pests and worms. Don't spray during your bloom times. If you ignore that and you still spray during your bloom times, cut off your blossoms for up to a year, depending on the plant. And once again, don't pick invasive species. So some people wonder, like, isn't any plant a good plant, especially if they attract pollinators? No, they are not good plants. The plant world is cutthroat. So I have this lovely image of like trees that might have, you know, a nice relationship with each other. A symbiotic relationship is what we call it. But in reality, the plants are really saying this: I'm only doing this for me. Yeah, same, whatever, I'll cooperate. If you've ever watched like any of the BBC, like the Planet Earth documentaries, look at the plant episodes, and if you just kind of change your lens to acknowledging like kind of how mean plants are to each other, it's really every plant for itself out there. So plants will only form relationships because they can get something really good out of it. Because, you know, like many species on Earth, they care about one thing, and that is reproducing the next generation, and they don't care how they do it. They don't care if they are killing off all of these other great plants that are providing biodiversity. So just to define invasive species, as Cecilia did earlier, it's a non-native organism. It can be a plant or an animal that causes an area economic or environmental harm. Unfortunately, humans tend to only care about invasive species once they cause the economic harm. But keep in mind, Cecilia said this earlier too, that not every non-native organism is invasive. So a good example of this is the honeybee, the European honeybee. It's not native to North America, but it's not doing anything bad. It's helping us pollinate things. So that's a great example. Earthworms are also another example that we'll get into a little bit deeper. At least in the Northeast, we have none of our original native earthworm species. So back when the last glacier came over, it froze and killed off all of those native earthworm species. So now we have ones from Europe and Asia, but not all of them are invasive, and they do a lot of good for our soil, and they're really important. So many popular ornamental plants are invasive species, and many, if not most, of the plant invasions in the United States can be traced back to some old British dude's greenhouse. Same thing with a lot of animals like swans. Swans came over as an ornamental garden piece, and now some species of swans are really ruining wetland ecosystem. The same goes for plants. They're brought over because they're pretty, and then they escape. So some of the popular ones that you're probably familiar with, especially if you're from New Hampshire, is Oriental bittersweet. There is a native bittersweet, which looks so similar to Oriental bittersweet. People like to use it for wreaths. Japanese honeysuckle, which I have to admit, I love it. But again, it is a really, really dense invasive. Japanese barberry is probably one of the most popular things that I see in people's gardens when I'm just walking my dog. And English ivy, which where I'm from in New York on Long Island, there is English ivy everywhere. Any abandoned building is covered in English ivy or kudzu. Here's some trees that might be popular. Norway maples. So that's the maple tree that has, I call them polynoses. I think other people call them like helicopter pods. But as a kid, we used to open up the seed pod and it's sticky on the inside and you stick it on your nose. But they have the seed pods that kind of helicopter down when you hold them up. A white poplar, which is a really cool tree. It's just not native to this area, and the black locust, which is also really, really pretty, which most invasive species, again, are really pretty. So that's what the leaves look like. This is what a Norway maple looks in full bloom. That's the white poplar. And that's the black locust. Black locusts are really popular for timber because they're just such a hard wood. And mostly the reason that trees are invasive is either their root systems are really stubborn and they spread out really wide and they outcompete other plants, or it's as simple as like shade. So like in the case of all of these trees, actually their big problem is that their canopies are so dense and they get so big that they just shade everything out and nothing else can grow. So here's kind of a list to look over, and if you guys have any questions in the chat, we'll take a look at that now. So popular vines, English ivy, periwinkle. I have a periwinkle plant, but it's in a pot. So if you want any of these really pretty species, you can always plant them in a pot and keep them indoors. You just need to monitor them. Kudzu, which I mentioned before, such a pretty vine. Chinese wisteria, one of the most beautiful plants I've ever laid my eyes on. Garlic mustard is really popular in people's yards, but it grows everywhere. So if you want it to eat, just go out and look for it. You'll find some. Japanese mugwort. Portulacas, unfortunately, are invasive and they can go a lot of places. So again, plant it in a pot, hang it up, really nice. Barberry, autumn olive, which is one of my favorite invasive species because again, it's so pretty. Purple loosestrife, which is a huge problem in New Hampshire. This is more of a wetland plant. And butterfly bush. So it can be really hard to part with our non-native plants, especially if we've had them for a long time. My mom has portulacas like just running in front of the house, like the entire house. Same thing with periwinkles. They're never going to get rid of them. But there are almost always like native counterparts, so things that either do the same job or they look very similar. So again, check out your state's local extension service.
There's also some really good Facebook groups that suggest alternatives to the prominent invasives.
Oh, thank you, Dorothy, for that call-in. So Dorothy just clarified for me that lichen, it's not a cross between fungi and algae, but rather it's a mutualistic association between the two. So thank you for that. And then I think you have a couple more slides, correct?
That's true.
Okay.
Okay. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of fall and spring cleaning. This is something that is very popular in a lot of gardens. My grandmother always had a very, very intense cleanup process. We bring the whole family over, cut everything to the ground, and we throw it in the compost. And it's actually, there's been a bit of a shift away from fall and spring cleaning, because what we're doing when we're cutting down those dead branches, we're actually getting rid of a lot of habitat that pollinators and beneficial insects need in order to overwinter. And so because we are attracting pollinators to these areas and along with pollinators, these beneficial insects, we want to make sure that we have somewhere that they can live over the winter time. And so by clear cutting our gardens down to the ground, we're actually getting rid of the habitat of these guys. Two of the ones that I think are the saddest are butterflies. So as we know, butterflies, they go into chrysalises, and in their little chrysalises, they're attached to a leaf while they turn themselves into goo. And when one of the places they love to build their chrysalises are on leaves, which sometimes fall to the ground before the chrysalis has turned into a butterfly. And a lot of times when we're doing our fall and spring cleaning, we're raking up those leaves, we're putting them into the compost or the garbage even, and oftentimes that can kill a fair number of butterflies that we're just trying to spend that time in their chrysalises. And so the recommendation with that is to just leave the leaves alone. Unfortunately, they can make the garden look a little bit unsightly, and if that is the case, like, you can rake them into a pile, but we would very much recommend trying to leave them as much as possible if you're interested in keeping those butterflies around. The other one that I think is very interesting is a lot of the woodier stems of these plants is where native bee populations go to overwinter. And so, like Maggie was saying, you can build these bee boxes, but a lot of times they're very specific about what they want, and they really just want to build their own places. And what a lot of them do is they bore down into the stalks of woody plants, and then they stay there over the winter, and then they come out in the spring. The problem if we cut them down is even if we're not composting them and we're just throwing them to the side, the bees can actually get confused about which way is out, and they can die in there not knowing how to escape from their overwintering site. And so the solution with the woody stalks, if you are very attached to cutting that garden down and making it so it doesn't look like this one down at the bottom, which I think is very cool, I think is very fun, but I think that if that's what my mother's garden looked like, she would not be happy. And so one of the ways you can go about that is you can cut the stalks off and then kind of store them in a bundle right side up, like against the side of the house, or maybe in an outdoor shed. And you can leave them there so that the bees have a place to stay over the winter. And then once there has been 5 days in a row of 50 degrees Fahrenheit or above, all of those bees that would have come out of overwintering will have, and you can dispose of those if you need to at that point. And so a lot of what I'm trying to say is, as much as you can, try not to clean up your garden because it makes it harder for these guys to overwinter. The other thing is that towards the end of the season, for example, in your vegetable gardens, a lot of like, the vegetables and herbs will start to bolt or like flower. And what I had always done when I was gardening with my mother was cut those off so that we can get the last little bits of vegetables. But the great thing about those flowering herbs and vegetables is that they're really great for late season pollinators. And so even though you're at the end of your bloom time for a lot of your wildflowers, those herbs like mint, for example, is really good for this, is a really, really good source of that last source of nectar for the bugs and pollinators that are going to migrate, as well as the ones that are going to go into overwintering.
So speaking of dead leaves, we're now going to talk about things that eat dead things. So we talked a lot about pollinators. It's time to shift gears a little bit because these guys are just as important, specifically for the soil health. So decomposers and detritivores. There's a little bit of a difference. So a decomposer is an organism that breaks down dead or decaying organisms, and they recycle the nutrients back into the environment. For example, fungi. So this is kind of an external breakdown, whereas a detritivore is a decomposer that consumes and eats the organic material, break it down, rather than decomposing something externally, for example, a worm, an earthworm. But lots of people wonder, like, the nutrients are already there in the environment, like, why do we need these guys to, like, eat it and digest it and then excrete it? So nutrients in dead and decaying organisms, they're usually in a more complex state, and they can't be used until they're broken down. So they're in a chemical compound, and maybe we need just the elements. So an organism can't use the compound, but they can use the element within that chemical, like oxygen, carbon, or nitrogen. So for example, maybe I don't want to consume ammonia, the chemical, but I definitely want to consume the nitrogen that's in that ammonia. So I'll wait for a decomposer to do its thing, separate the compounds, and then I'm left with just the nitrogen and the 3 hydrogens, and I can go and eat up that nitrogen. So they're basically just making the job easier for other organisms to absorb a nutrient. So you have to grow to love your decomposers. They're usually not people's favorites, but they should be, because our food chain would not be self-sustaining without them. They are the heart or the kidneys of ecology. We absolutely cannot survive without them. Pollinators, hey, some really, really advanced scientists are trying to make mechanical pollinators. Good luck trying to make a mechanical decomposer. So we refer to our decomposers as the FBI because they are fungi, bacteria, and insects. So that's just a fun little acronym that I like. So for fungi, we really only see a fraction of the fungal community above ground. Most of the magic happens underneath the surface. So fungi release enzymes that break down dead and decaying matter, absorb the nutrients, and then it's recycled back into the soil when the fungus itself decays. This process relies on water, which is why you find fungi in moist areas. We could talk about fungi for hours. They are arguably one of the most important organisms on Earth. So trust us, you absolutely want to create a healthy ecosystem for mushrooms. I am absolutely not a fungus expert. So there is a video, a short one that you guys can watch on your own time that walks you through why some of those relationships are important with an actual expert on mushrooms. Bacteria, most of them are good, not all of them are bad. They're the absolute kings of decomposition. And just like fungi, they use enzymes to break down their food into simpler substances, lots of different shapes, sizes, arrangements. And after decomposing another organism, they release the nutrients like nitrogen and phosphate that they've absorbed back into the environment. And so if you can also watch this video a little bit later. It's just a bowl of molding fruit, and as it decomposes, it starts growing different molds and fungi, and you can see the bacteria at work, and then potatoes start growing, and it makes way for insects. So tons of species of insects provide services at decomposer, but one of the most common are springtails, super, super tiny. They are considered the krill of the common garden. So 1 square meter of average soil can contain up to 60,000 springtail bugs. So they're just everywhere. Other similar mites, they're just as abundant, but springtails are vegetarian, and so other mites can be predatory towards other animals. Nematodes and roundworms are also pretty common bugs that eat soil, fungi, bacteria, and other dead organisms. So there are tons of insects up there. There are also crustaceans in our soil, which are really cool. So woodlice, pillbugs, sowbugs, whatever you want to call them. There's lots of different species. You can tell by the fact that they don't have 6 legs that they're not an insect. They're actually our only purely terrestrial crustacean that we know of. They breathe with gills. There are over 5,000 species. So you might think like, oh, well, I see crabs walking around on the land. They're a crustacean. Crabs still got to go back into the water to lay their eggs. These guys don't, but they still require a lot of moisture. And these guys are also like, they're blamed for holes in plants and vegetables and tree stumps, but their jaws are just too weak to do this. So don't blame it on them. That usually means that you have a slug or a snail problem or a wood-boring beetle. Let's talk about beetles, flies and worms. So maggots are beetle and fly larvae. They eat dead material like wood and decaying flesh. So the sight of them might be gross, but life would be even grosser without them. They eat, break down, and they even bury feces and carrion, which is dead animals, and start for their offspring. So I am going, you don't have to watch it, you can look away. So just a disclaimer that this is kind of a gross decomposition video, but I really want you to see the end of this video. So this is going to be, this is a monitor lizard, and there are going to be a bunch of maggots eating away at it. So we're going to kind of skip to the middle here. And you can really see them going to town. I'm not sure how long this video was taken for, but they're really going to town on this lizard, eating all of the flesh, leaving behind the stronger things like the skin. And pause on that image. So as gross as that was to watch, and there's kind of fluid and stuff, this skeleton is completely clean. Like, it's the only thing that could make that thing cleaner is bleach. So this just goes to show, like, maggots themselves, really gross, but the job that they do is so essential. They are cleaning up our earth. Other similar organisms are like opossums and turkey vultures. They're really gross, but they do us a great service and they're a really good thing to have around. Same thing with the maggots in your soil and in your garden. Just make sure that they're not in your flower drawer. And now we're going to talk a little bit about worms. Worms are arguably one of the most important soil bugs. I know we've said that for almost everything in this presentation, but they do a lot more than just break down organic matter like leaf litter. They push through the soil, they eat and excrete it after digesting all that organic matter. They put it back into the ecosystem, and this ensures healthy soil structure, aeration, and drainage. So worms are really, really important. No, we do not need to see that again. But there are evil worms out there. You probably have them. Report them to your local extension. So that seems dramatic, calling them evil, but they really are. You may have heard of jumping worms or snake worms. So if you were to pick up a jumping worm and just your normal everyday earthworm, the jumping worm would be flailing around wildly. It might even like cut off its own tail or detach its own tail rather, to try to get away from you. So they're pretty dramatic. So this family, they come from Asia. They are invasive. Keep in mind, again, there are no earthworms that are native to the Northeast anymore. The glaciers wiped out our indigenous species. So our native plants did evolve without earthworms, but the presence of non-native earthworms are super important, important for our soil health and structure. But the reason why jumping worms are not good for our soil is because how they eat and how they excrete. So they feed on the top layer of soil, mostly the leaf litter and stuff that has the most nutrients in there. And then they excrete kind of this coffee ground soil, which I'm sure a lot of us have seen in our compost areas. It doesn't have a lot of nutrients, doesn't have much structure to it. So a lot of common garden plants, they're going to do fine if these worms are in the area, but the native plants are not going to do so great in soil like this because they've evolved specifically for the soil in this region. And another reason why they're a big problem is because they're asexual, so they can lay eggs without mating, and so they're doing a great job of expanding their range really slowly and surely, leaving behind habitats that are just unsuitable for less problematic species. So for more info, you can take a look at these links when we email you the presentation. Yeah, and then we can, you can take a look at this to see some more decomposers in action on your own time. And then that kind of brings us to the end of our presentation. So we just wanted to give a shout out at some of the places that helped us with our research. Wow, I can't speak today. The Xerces Society is really great information, monarchwatch.org, and of course the US Forest Service. We love that place. Yeah.
And then the last thing, I just added some additional resources. I can't say enough about the UNH extension. They have lists of native species. They have how to put in these native species, and unending videos about gardening. And they also have that helpline, which is so, so cool. I haven't done it yet, but I'm really excited to call them this spring when I have any problem. The New Hampshire Audubon has a really good YouTube pollinator series. It's a webinar that I would very much recommend. If you're into podcasts, the UNH extension put out a gardening Granite State podcast. Pollination is all about pollinators, which is really cool. There's also a lot of really great community organizations in New Hampshire, like the Pollinator Pathways of New Hampshire and the Ecological Landscape Alliance. So we would very much recommend you check those places out. And that brings us to our conclusion.